Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is provided strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. It does not constitute legal, financial, or psychological advice. Every divorce case is unique, and laws vary significantly across different states. We strongly advise all viewers to conduct their own due diligence and consult with a licensed attorney or a qualified professional regarding their specific circumstances. In the United States, there is a silent, systemic shift occurring in the shadows of the family court system that remains largely unaddressed in mainstream media. Statistics suggest that divorced men in America are up to 8 times more likely to take their own lives than divorced women. This is not just a tragedy, it is a national cultural emergency. For decades, the narrative surrounding the end of a marriage has been framed through a singular lens, often leaving men to navigate a fragmented landscape of social isolation, financial devastation, and a total loss of identity. We are witnessing the collapse of the traditional male support structure, and today we are going to pull back the curtain on why the historical divorce help industry has failed men, and how a new movement of specialized support is finally beginning to bridge that gap. If you have ever felt like the system was stacked against you, or if you are currently standing at the precipice of a life-altering legal battle, what we are about to discuss will change the way you view your future. This deep dive masterclass is designed to solve one of the most pressing problems facing the modern American male: the lack of a clear, objective roadmap for navigating the cultural and systemic hurdles of divorce. By the end of this series, you will understand the historical trends that shape the current legal environment, the psychological traps that lead to unfavorable potential outcomes, and the specific case studies of men who have successfully transitioned from the provider role into a new, empowered version of themselves. We are moving beyond the surface-level advice of just lawyer up, and digging into the structural reality of what it means to be a man in the U.S. family court system in the 21st century. To understand where we are, we must first look at the historical trends that shifted the American landscape. The introduction of no-fault divorce laws, starting with California in 1969, fundamentally altered the contractual nature of marriage. Before this, divorce required a fault: adultery, cruelty, or abandonment. The shift to irreconcilable differences was intended to reduce conflict, but for many men, it created a new kind of vulnerability. Culturally, the American male was raised on the archetype of the stoic provider. This identity is often tied directly to the home, the children, and the financial stability of the family unit. When a divorce occurs, this identity is not just challenged, it is often incinerated overnight. The cultural impact of this identity loss cannot be overstated. When a man loses his role as the daily protector and provider, he often enters a phase known by sociologists as role exit. Unlike women, who historical data suggests often maintain wider social safety nets and emotional support systems, many men find that their entire social circle was tethered to their wife's social calendar. Consequently, the first hurdle in seeking help is overcoming the stoic trap. This is the cultural expectation that a man should handle his problems internally, without complaining or seeking external guidance. This behavior often leads to disastrous potential outcomes in the courtroom, as men may agree to unfavorable settlements simply to get it over with, or to prove they are still providing, even at their own long-term expense. Let's look at a case study involving the financial toll of this cultural expectation. Consider a hypothetical professional in a high-cost area like Northern Virginia or Southern California. Under traditional alimony and child support frameworks, a man might find himself responsible for a significant percentage of his gross income in post-tax obligations. Without specialized divorce help that understands the nuances of imputed income or vocational evaluations, a man might inadvertently agree to a lifestyle he can no longer afford while living in a one-bedroom apartment, while his former spouse remains in the family home. The cultural impact here is the creation of a new poor class of professional men who are working more hours than ever, but seeing less of the fruits of their labor, leading to burnout and chronic health issues. Furthermore, we must address the tender years doctrine. While this legal principle, which suggested children are better off with their mothers during their formative years, has been officially abolished in most states, its ghost still haunts many courtrooms. Historical trends show that even in gender-neutral states, the default often leans toward a primary and secondary parent model, rather than a 50-50 shared parenting split. This is where the cultural movement of fathers' rights groups has stepped in. These organizations are not just about legalities, they are about shifting the cultural perception of a father from a secondary caregiver or a weekend visitor to an essential, irreplaceable presence in a child's life. The rise of specialized divorce coaching for men is a direct response to this need. Unlike a lawyer, who focuses on the what of the law, a divorce coach for men focuses on the how of the transition. This involves step-by-step details on how to communicate via parenting apps to avoid high-conflict traps, how to rebuild a social circle from scratch, and how to manage the gray rock method when dealing with a high-conflict former spouse. This is a crucial component of the help ecosystem because it addresses the emotional volatility that often causes men to make reactive decisions that lawyers then have to spend thousands of dollars trying to fix in court. In the U.S., the cost of a contested divorce can range from $15,000 to well over $100,000 depending on the complexity of assets and the intensity of the custody battle. When men do not seek specialized help early, they often fall into the trap of litigation by exhaustion. This is a strategy where one party intentionally drags out the process to deplete the other's financial and emotional reserves. By understanding the cultural landscape, men can learn to pivot from a defensive, reactive posture to a strategic, proactive one. This includes understanding business valuation in a divorce context, especially for those who are self-employed or have ownership stakes in companies, where the double-dipping of assets and income can occur if not properly managed by experts. The psychological reconstruction of the male identity post-divorce is perhaps the most significant cultural shift we are seeing today. There is a burgeoning industry of retreats, support groups, and digital communities dedicated specifically to the rebuild. These spaces allow men to process the grief of the death of the dream without the stigma of being perceived as weak. We are seeing a move away from the bitter divorcee trope toward a more holistic, optimized version of the single father. This involves a focus on physical health, financial literacy, and emotional intelligence as a tool for better co-parenting. As we move forward in this masterclass, it is essential to recognize that divorce help is no longer just about a stack of legal documents. It is about a total recalibration of your life's trajectory. The data shows that men who engage with support systems early, whether through therapy, coaching, or specialized legal advocacy, report higher levels of long-term life satisfaction and better relationships with their children 5 to 10 years down the line. We are moving toward an era where the disposable father myth is being dismantled by men who are informed, prepared, and culturally aware of the hurdles they face. By examining the historical trends and the potential outcomes of various strategies, we can begin to build a roadmap that doesn't just aim for survival, but for a successful and stable new chapter in the American experience. Building on that roadmap, we have to recognize that the very fabric of male socialization in 2026 is undergoing a radical transformation. For decades, the cultural default for a man facing the dissolution of his marriage was absolute, crushing isolation. Men traditionally centralized their entire emotional support system within their spouse, meaning when the marriage ended, the support system vanished simultaneously. This created a vacuum where destructive habits flourished and mental health rapidly declined. But historical trends over the last 5 years show a massive pivot in how American men navigate this crisis. Let us look at a case study of a man we will call Robert, a logistics manager from Ohio. When Robert faced a separation, his initial instinct, programmed by generations of stoic male culture, was to retreat. He rented a small apartment, stopped speaking to his mutual friends, and buried himself in 60-hour work weeks to numb the psychological impact. The potential outcome of this traditional path is almost always severe burnout and a diminished capacity to engage meaningfully in complex custody arrangements. However, Robert intersected with a newly emerging cultural phenomenon: structured, outcome-oriented divorce support networks designed exclusively for men. These are not the grievance-filled meetings of past decades. These are high-level, strategically focused environments where men deconstruct the emotional volatility of their situation and rebuild, using actionable, peer-reviewed psychological frameworks. By engaging with this modernized help, Robert transformed his trajectory from isolated survival to active, community-backed stabilization. This shift from isolation to mobilization is the first critical pillar of the modern roadmap, fundamentally altering the cultural expectation that men must suffer in silence. Now let us transition into the financial theater, because you cannot discuss the cultural impact of divorce help without addressing the profound economic anxiety that paralyzes so many men across the United States today. Imagine if you spent 15 years diligently contributing to an employer-matched retirement fund, meticulously paying down the mortgage on a family home in suburban Atlanta, and investing in a shared vision of the future. Suddenly, that vision shatters. The traditional cultural narrative often subtly pressured men to take the financial hit, walk away with a fraction of their net worth, and start from scratch out of a misplaced sense of chivalry or to avoid being labeled as difficult. Modern educational resources for men are actively dismantling this destructive narrative. The focus has entirely shifted toward objective asset recalibration and long-term financial autonomy. It is about removing the raw emotion from the spreadsheet and treating the dissolution as a complex business transaction. Men are now being educated on the severe long-term tax implications of liquidating retirement accounts prematurely versus keeping home equity. They are learning how to properly assess the value of a small business without letting opposing counsel artificially inflate its worth to extract higher spousal support. Take the case study of Michael, an independent contractor in Florida. Under the outdated cultural model, Michael might have conceded his business assets just to avoid a protracted legal conflict. Instead, utilizing contemporary, specialized financial divorce education, he learned how to source a neutral forensic accountant to properly evaluate his holdings. He understood the historical trends of how courts view commingled assets and structured a settlement that preserved his operational capital. This is not about hiding money or avoiding legal responsibilities. It is about demanding empirical fairness and refusing to accept the role of the perpetual financial martyr. When men maintain their economic foundation, they remain functional, productive members of society, which benefits the entire cultural ecosystem, especially the children involved. Speaking of children, the cultural evolution of the American father post-divorce is perhaps the most striking change we are witnessing in 2026. The historical standard of the every other weekend dad is fading rapidly, replaced by a fierce, organized demand for equitable, equal parenting time. But demanding time in a courtroom is only half the equation. Managing that time effectively is the true cultural test. Imagine if your entire domestic routine, from packing school lunches to managing pediatric dental appointments and organizing extracurricular schedules, was previously handled predominantly by your spouse. Stepping into a shared parenting schedule requires a massive, immediate acquisition of domestic and logistical skills that many men simply were not trained for. Modern divorce heavily emphasizes this operational transition. We see comprehensive training programs emerging that teach men how to seamlessly integrate into the primary caregiver role without missing a beat. Let us examine James from Arizona. James transitioned into a complex, equal-shared parenting schedule. Initially, the constant handoffs and communication requirements with a high-conflict former partner created immense stress and disrupted the children. By tapping into specialized male-focused co-parenting education, James learned highly regulated communication methods, keeping interactions brief, informative, friendly, and firm. He learned how to utilize centralized co-parenting applications to document all shared expenses and schedule changes, completely removing the need for toxic, reactive text message exchanges. The cultural impact here is profound and generational. We are raising a cohort of American children who see their fathers not just as weekend entertainers or disciplinarians, but as fully capable, emotionally present, and domestically competent caregivers. This shatters old gender roles and elevates the status of single fathers across the nation. Underpinning all of these logistical and financial shifts is a massive mental health renaissance among divorced men. Historically, men actively avoided therapy during a divorce out of a legitimate fear. It would be used against them in family court as evidence of instability. This weaponization of mental health was a terrifying deterrent that kept men sick and isolated. Today, educational advocates and legal strategists are teaching men how to safely prioritize their psychological well-being while protecting their legal standing. Men are learning the critical difference between clinical depression and situational grief, and they are seeking targeted coaching to navigate the immense cortisol spikes and chronic stress associated with family restructuring. They are utilizing confidential, specialized counselors who deeply understand the unique trauma of family court litigation. The cultural stigma of a man asking for help is evaporating, replaced by the pragmatic understanding that a mentally optimized, emotionally regulated father is the greatest asset his children can have during a traumatic family transition. This stabilization is the ultimate goal of the modern support infrastructure. We are moving men from a state of reactive panic to a state of proactive, strategic calm. But achieving this calm requires more than just a supportive community and organized spreadsheets. It requires a fundamental, granular understanding of the actual battlefield, where these life-altering transitions are formalized. You can have the best mindset in the world, the tightest budget, and the most sincere desire to co-parent effectively, but if you do not understand the mechanical, often brutal realities of the depositions, the discovery process, and the specific psychological profiles of the legal professional sitting across the aisle from you, your entire roadmap can be derailed in a single afternoon. How exactly does the system attempt to provoke you into making a fatal error? And what are the precise, counterintuitive steps you must master to neutralize those provocations before you ever step foot inside a courtroom? The family court system in the United States, as it operates in 2026, is fundamentally an adversarial arena built on a framework of conflict and attrition. It does not inherently seek truth. It seeks resolution through leverage. For men entering this arena, the greatest vulnerability is not a lack of legal representation, but a lack of psychological armor. The primary tactic utilized by opposing counsel in high-conflict cases is the deliberate provocation of the male ego. Historical trends demonstrate that when a man feels his character as a father or a provider is being unjustly attacked, his biological instinct is to fiercely defend his honor. In a normal social setting, this is a natural human reaction. In family court, it is a catastrophic liability. The system anticipates this reactivity and actively lays traps designed to generate documented evidence of instability, anger, or erratic behavior. Consider the initial filing process and the weaponization of the affidavit. An affidavit is a sworn statement of facts, but in the context of a contested divorce, it often reads like a heavily curated work of fiction designed to maximize the petitioner's leverage. Imagine if you are a devoted father who has coached every youth soccer game, attended every parent-teacher conference, and provided unbroken financial stability for a decade. Suddenly, you are handed a legal document, stamped by a judge, wherein your former partner categorizes you as an emotionally absent, financially controlling, and potentially dangerous individual. The immediate, visceral response for most men is blinding outrage. The instinct is to immediately fire off a lengthy, emotionally charged text message demanding an explanation, or worse, to confront the former spouse in person. This exact moment is where specialized divorce help for men intervenes with the first counterintuitive protocol: absolute tactical silence. Let us examine a public character case study of a man we will call Christopher, a dedicated high school teacher navigating a contentious separation in Texas. When Christopher received an emergency ex parte motion filled with severe exaggerations about his parenting, his traditional instinct was to call his wife and aggressively dispute every claim. His specialized support network immediately implemented a communication blackout. They educated Christopher on the reality that any response, no matter how justified, would be legally framed as harassment or intimidation, thereby validating the very claims made in the affidavit. Instead, Christopher channeled that immense frustration into drafting a clinical, deeply detailed chronological timeline of his actual parenting involvement, backed by receipts, emails, and third-party witness accounts. He handed this sterile data to his attorney. By refusing to engage emotionally, Christopher neutralized the provocation and forced the opposing counsel to argue against hard data rather than his emotional reaction. The potential outcome of this discipline is the preservation of your credibility before the judge. Beyond the initial filings, the provocation extends deeply into the financial discovery phase. Discovery is legally intended to ensure transparency of the marital estate, but in practice, it is frequently utilized as a mechanism of psychological warfare. Men are often subjected to aggressive subpoenas demanding a decade of bank statements, meticulous accounting of every business lunch, and intrusive inquiries into personal spending habits. The goal is rarely to find a hidden offshore account. The goal is to make the process so overwhelmingly painful and expensive that the man simply capitulates to an unfavorable settlement just to stop the bleeding. The cultural impact of this tactic is severe, leading to immense financial anxiety and a pervasive sense of being criminalized for simply managing the family finances over the years. Imagine if your entire financial history, every minor purchase and investment decision you made over a 15-year marriage, was suddenly scrutinized by a forensic accountant tasked specifically with painting you as fiscally reckless. Defending against this retroactively is a nightmare. Modern divorce support shifts the paradigm by teaching men to build preemptive financial dossiers long before the first petition is ever filed. Men are now learning to categorize their asset columns, pull their own credit reports, secure their digital financial footprints, and create indisputable spreadsheets of marital versus non-marital property. By adopting this proactive, hyper-organized posture, men remove the shock value of discovery. When opposing counsel demands documentation, handing over a perfectly indexed, digitized financial binder instantly diffuses the intimidation tactic and signals to the court that you are operating from a position of absolute transparency and unshakable competence. The ultimate arena of provocation, however, is the deposition. A deposition is an interrogation conducted under oath, typically in a sterile conference room, recorded by a court reporter, and driven entirely by the opposing attorney. The cultural narrative often fails to prepare men for the sheer hostility of this environment. The opposing counsel is not there to listen to your side of the story. They are there to dismantle your narrative, twist your words, and provoke a display of temper that can be read into the official court record. They will intentionally ask misleading questions, utilize uncomfortable silences to force you to keep talking, and aggressively challenge your integrity as a father. This brings us to the case study of David, a regional sales director operating in the 2026 corporate landscape of New York. Recognizing his naturally assertive personality could be leveraged against him, David engaged in intensive mock depositions with a specialized divorce coach. They simulated the most aggressive, insulting lines of questioning imaginable regarding his fidelity, his business ethics, and his relationship with his children. They drilled the counterintuitive responses, pausing for 3 full seconds before answering any question, giving strictly binary yes or no answers whenever possible, and completely stripping his vocal tone of any defensiveness or sarcasm. When the actual deposition occurred, David was an impenetrable fortress of calm. When the opposing lawyer attempted to agitate him with baseless accusations, David simply replied that he did not agree with that characterization, and fell silent. He offered zero additional information for them to weaponize. By mastering this emotional regulation, David protected his custody baseline and forced the opposing side to negotiate based on facts rather than his behavioral missteps. The cultural shift we are observing is monumental. Men are transitioning from being reactive participants in a system designed to exploit their emotions, to becoming highly trained, strategic operators who understand the exact mechanics of legal leverage. You have survived the initial shock of the filing. You have meticulously protected your assets during the grueling marathon of financial discovery. You have maintained flawless composure under the intense, targeted pressure of hostile depositions. You are legally stabilized, your custody schedule is secured, and the financial bleeding has been staunched. But what happens when the gavel finally falls, the final decree is signed, the lawyers pack up their briefcases, and you are standing completely alone in a quiet, unfamiliar apartment on your very first weekend without your children? The true cultural test of the modern divorced man is not merely surviving the brutal machinery of the court system. It is surviving the deafening silence that immediately follows. How do you rebuild a shattered identity from absolute zero? And what is the hidden, dangerous biological toll this specific transition takes on the male nervous system if left entirely unmanaged? The biological toll of this transition is an invisible epidemic that the traditional family court system completely ignores. When the final decree is signed and the immediate threat of litigation subsides, the male body undergoes a drastic physiological crash. For months or even years, a man navigating a contested divorce operates in a state of chronic sympathetic nervous system arousal. This is the fight or flight response, characterized by massive, sustained spikes in cortisol and adrenaline. Historical trends from earlier decades show that men simply internalize this biological chaos, often masking the profound physical exhaustion with socially acceptable coping mechanisms like excessive alcohol consumption or burying themselves in 80-hour work weeks. The potential outcomes of ignoring this chronic stress are severe, frequently manifesting as autoimmune issues, sudden cardiovascular events, and profound clinical depression. In 2026, modern divorce help for men has radically shifted its focus to address this biological reality as the foundational step of the rebuilding phase. Before you can construct a new life, you must first stabilize the organism. Imagine if you have spent the last 15 years walking through the front door of your home at 6 o'clock every evening, greeted by the chaotic, vibrant noise of family life. There are backpacks on the floor, dinner cooking, children asking for help with homework, and a continuous stream of domestic management. Your brain has physically wired itself to this specific environment. Your dopamine baseline is intrinsically linked to your role as the active, daily father and husband. Now imagine walking into a sterile, one-bedroom apartment on a Friday night when you do not have custody of your children. The silence is not just quiet. It is physically deafening. It creates a sensory vacuum that triggers a profound psychological panic. The brain, suddenly deprived of its primary environmental stimuli and its core identity feedback loop, essentially goes into a state of withdrawal. The man is left standing in the center of an empty room, realizing that his entire identity as a daily provider and protector has been abruptly erased. This is the moment of absolute zero, and it is the most dangerous juncture in the entire post-divorce timeline. Let us examine the case study of Marcus, a senior structural engineer living in Chicago in the current year of 2026. When Marcus finalized his divorce, he secured a fair financial settlement and an equal shared parenting schedule. Legally, he was victorious. Biologically and psychologically, he was entirely destroyed. During the first month of his new reality, Marcus experienced severe insomnia, rapid weight loss, and an inability to focus on complex engineering schematics at work. His nervous system was locked in a state of hypervigilance, anticipating a legal attack or a hostile text message that was no longer coming. Under the outdated cultural model, Marcus would have been told to simply move on or get back out there and start dating. Instead, Marcus engaged with a specialized men's recovery cohort that understood the mechanics of somatic trauma. They did not start with talk therapy, they started with biological regulation. The step-by-step details of this regulation are vital for understanding the modern cultural shift in male support. First, Marcus was guided through strict circadian rhythm resetting protocols. When the male nervous system is dysregulated by the trauma of family separation, sleep architecture is the first pillar to collapse. Without deep, restorative delta wave sleep, the brain cannot clear the cortisol buildup, leading to a vicious cycle of anxiety and exhaustion. Marcus implemented rigorous morning sunlight exposure, completely eliminated digital screens 2 hours before bed, and utilized specific breathwork techniques designed to manually override the sympathetic nervous system and engage the parasympathetic rest and digest state. He was taught to view his physical recovery not as a vanity project, but as a critical survival strategy. You cannot outthink a dysregulated nervous system. You must mechanically calm it down. Once the biological baseline is stabilized, the true work of identity architecture begins. Historical trends indicate that men often try to rush this phase, desperately attempting to plug the massive hole in their life with a new relationship, a reckless financial purchase, or a destructive addiction. Modern divorce education emphasizes the concept of the strategic void. Men are taught to sit with the discomfort of the empty apartment and actively deconstruct the architecture of their former life. Marcus had to confront the reality that he had outsourced almost all of his emotional regulation and social calendar management to his former wife. He did not know how to cultivate male friendships outside of the context of couples dinners or coaching Little League. He had to learn the granular details of adult socialization from scratch. This rebuild requires a man to perform a ruthless inventory of his core values, stripping away the expectations placed upon him by his former marriage, his extended family, and society at large. The potential outcomes of dedicating 6 to 12 months to this solitary focused reconstruction are incredibly positive. Men who engage in this structured recovery process report a massive resurgence in authentic self-confidence. They begin to pursue physical fitness goals they abandoned a decade prior. They optimize their professional output because they are no longer bleeding cognitive energy into a toxic domestic environment. They become sharply defined, highly functional individuals rather than hollowed-out shells of their former selves. Marcus systematically rebuilt his life by joining a local woodworking collective, establishing a rigid but healthy daily routine for the days he did not have his children, and learning to find deep, genuine peace in his own solitude. He transformed the terrifying silence of his apartment into a sanctuary of personal growth and absolute peace. However, achieving internal stabilization and biological regulation is only the preparatory phase. You have mastered the silence of the empty apartment, your sleep architecture is restored, and your physical health is optimized. You have successfully navigated the internal crucible. But eventually, you have to open the front door and step back into a society that views the divorced man through a highly specific, often incredibly biased cultural lens. The external world is waiting, and it operates by a completely different set of unwritten rules. How do you navigate the treacherous waters of former mutual friends who have quietly chosen a side? And what happens when a modernized, fully stabilized man decides it is time to re-enter a modern dating market that has been radically altered by algorithms, social media, and shifting gender dynamics over the last decade? Stepping out of the hyper-regulated vacuum of personal recovery and into the modern social ecosystem of 2026 presents a completely unprecedented set of cultural hurdles. For a man who has spent the last decade or more building his identity within the framework of a married couple, the immediate social reality is often a brutal awakening. Historical trends indicate that upon the dissolution of a marriage, the shared social circle fractures unequally. mutual friends, couples you vacation with, and neighbors you hosted for years often default to the party who controls the primary social calendar or narrative. Imagine if you walk into your local hardware store or attend a community event, only to be met with averted eyes and polite, but icy distance from people you consider brothers and sisters. The traditional male response to this social excommunication was either profound resentment or a desperate, humiliating attempt to win back the approval of the community. Modern divorce support networks for men fundamentally interrupt this self-destructive cycle. They educate men on the concept of social pruning. Instead of fighting a losing battle against a narrative they cannot control in their old social sphere, stabilized men are taught to ruthlessly cut ties with any environment that requires them to defend their character. The cultural impact of this is the rise of entirely new organic male fraternities. Men are actively building fresh networks based on shared post-divorce realities, physical fitness communities, and professional masterminds, completely bypassing the toxic gossip chains of their former suburban lives. This step-by-step detachment involves archiving old group chats, declining invitations to shared historical events, and actively pursuing entirely new hobbies where their identity is defined solely by their present actions, not their past marriage. But replacing friends is only a fraction of the challenge. The true shock to the system occurs when a stabilized man attempts to re-enter a dating market that operates on a completely different technological and psychological axis than the one he left behind 15 years ago. If you got married in 2011, you missed the entire foundational evolution of algorithmic matchmaking. You are stepping into an arena in 2026 that is hyper-visual, ruthlessly efficient, and governed by artificial intelligence sorting mechanisms designed to keep users swiping rather than connecting. Let us examine the case study of Daniel, a 42-year-old supply chain director living in Austin, Texas. Daniel successfully navigated a high-conflict divorce, stabilized his nervous system, and achieved excellent physical health. When he finally downloaded modern digital matchmaking platforms, his initial approach was to present himself as the classic traditional provider. He quickly discovered that the algorithmic market does not prioritize the same virtues that sustained his previous long-term relationship. He was hit with a barrage of superficial filtering, conversational ghosting, and a culture of endless options that completely overwhelmed his traditional courtship instincts. The potential outcomes for men who face this without a modern strategy are profound emotional burnout, a collapse of their newly rebuilt self-esteem, and a dangerous slide back into depressive isolation. This is where specialized coaching ecosystems are actively rewriting the script for single fathers. The cultural narrative historically painted the divorced dad as a tragic figure, living out of suitcases, financially drained, and desperate for female companionship to fill the void of his broken home. Modern education completely inverts this dynamic. Men are being trained to view their newly stabilized lives as an absolute premium asset in the marketplace. Daniel was taught to stop attempting to market himself to the masses, and instead utilize the extreme vetting skills he developed during his legal battles to screen potential partners. He learned step-by-step details on how to format his social presence not as a man searching for a replacement partner, but as a highly autonomous, emotionally intelligent leader of his own life. The coaching focused heavily on identifying the psychological red flags of high-conflict personality traits early in the dating process, ensuring that Daniel did not accidentally invite the exact same chaos back into his life in a different package. By shifting his mindset from the hunted to the evaluator, Daniel completely neutralized the anxiety of the modern dating machine. Furthermore, there is a massive financial and legal vulnerability inherent in re-entering the romantic sphere that traditional advice completely overlooks. Imagine if you have spent $100,000 in 3 years of your life untangling your assets from your former spouse, finally securing your retirement and your home equity. The biological drive for intimacy and the psychological desire to prove you are still desirable can lead men directly into the catastrophic trap of the accelerated rebound relationship. Without proper guidance, men frequently rush into cohabitation scenarios with new partners simply to recreate the domestic comfort they lost. In many jurisdictions across the United States, this triggers immediate and hidden legal liabilities. Modern support structures provide rigorous education on the dangers of common law marriage statutes, the severe financial risks of commingling bank accounts with a new partner, and the absolute necessity of drafting ironclad cohabitation agreements before a single piece of furniture is moved in. The goal is to enforce a strict period of dating probation. Men are taught to strictly separate their new romantic endeavors from their financial fortresses. The integration of a new partner into the lives of your children is treated with equal surgical precision by modern divorce advocates. The historical trend was often a chaotic, rushed merging of families that resulted in immense psychological stress for the children and astronomical failure rates for the second relationship. Today, men are educated on the precise step-by-step process of parallel parenting, while maintaining a completely separate romantic life for a minimum of 12 to 18 months. This involves creating hard physical boundaries, refusing to allow a new partner to discipline the children under any circumstances, and ensuring that the father and child dynamic remains fiercely protected from any outside influence. When a man masters this final phase of stabilization, the cultural impact is undeniable. He becomes a highly optimized pillar of stability. He is physically fit, legally and financially secure, socially insulated by a loyal brotherhood, and operating within a romantic life governed entirely by his own carefully constructed boundaries. He has achieved the ultimate victory over the family court system and the cultural expectations that tried to break him. He is essentially untouchable. But what happens when the former spouse, who fully expected him to fail, witnesses this incredible stabilization and upward trajectory from afar? What occurs when the resentment of his newfound success triggers a new, completely unexpected legal attack? And how do men prepare for the terrifying reality of the post-decree modification designed specifically to drag them back into the courtroom and dismantle the empire they just spent years rebuilding? The post-decree modification is the hidden landmine of the American family court system, and understanding its mechanics is crucial for any man attempting to secure his long-term future. Historically, the cultural narrative surrounding divorce ended at the judge signing the final order. The assumption was that both parties would simply go their separate ways. However, historical trends over the last 2 decades reveal a much darker reality. When a man successfully utilizes modern support networks to rebuild his life, stabilize his mental health, and accelerate his career, he fundamentally breaks the cultural expectation of the defeated, impoverished divorced father. This visible success often generates profound cognitive dissonance and resentment in a high-conflict former spouse. The legal mechanism they use to weaponize that resentment is the petition for modification. This is not a request for a minor adjustment. It is a calculated, strategic legal strike designed to claim a percentage of the man's new wealth, or to violently disrupt the stable environment he has created for his children. The system allows for these modifications under the guise of a substantial change in circumstances, a dangerously broad legal standard that practically invites continuous litigation. Imagine if you have spent 3 grueling years pulling yourself out of the financial and psychological wreckage of a highly contested divorce. You paid your legal fees, you accepted a difficult initial settlement just to secure your peace, and you methodically rebuilt your professional reputation. By the current year of 2026, you have finally purchased a new home, you received a massive promotion at work, and you are providing a spectacular life for your children during your custody time. You are finally breathing freely. Then, on a random Tuesday evening, a process server knocks on your front door and hands you a thick legal envelope. Your former partner has filed a motion demanding an exorbitant increase in child support, an adjustment to spousal maintenance, and a reduction in your parenting time, citing your new demanding job as evidence that you are suddenly an unavailable parent. The immediate biological response is a devastating return to the fight-or-flight panic you thought you left behind years ago. Without modern education, the potential outcomes of this second-wave attack are catastrophic. Men often capitulate immediately out of sheer exhaustion, surrendering their newly earned resources simply to stop the harassment. Modern divorce help for men anticipates this exact scenario and trains men to operate from a posture of perpetual readiness. Let us examine the case study of William, a senior software architect living in Seattle. Following his divorce, William leveraged his newfound time and focused to launch a highly successful independent consulting firm. His income doubled within 24 months. Under the outdated cultural model, William would have kept all his finances in a traditional personal checking account, completely exposed to the scrutiny of opposing counsel during a modification fishing expedition. Instead, engaging with advanced financial and legal coaching for single fathers, William learned the absolute necessity of rigorous structural separation. He worked with specialized corporate attorneys and forensic accountants to build ironclad corporate veils around his business entity. He was educated on the vital difference between personal draw and retained business earnings, utilized for operational growth. When his former spouse eventually filed the inevitable modification petition demanding a massive payout based on the gross revenue of his new company, William did not panic. He did not send an angry text message. He simply deployed his legal team, who handed the opposing counsel a flawlessly documented, legally impenetrable financial disclosure that explicitly proved his new business assets were insulated and not subject to personal income calculations for the purposes of the specific modification requested. By anticipating the attack, William neutralized it efficiently and completely protected his rebuilt empire. But the financial attack is only one vector of the post-decree modification. When a high-conflict individual realizes they cannot pierce the financial armor of a stabilized man, they almost universally pivot to attacking his relationship with his children. This is the custody modification, and its cultural impact on fathers is uniquely devastating. The tactic involves fabricating concerns about the father's new living situation, his new social circle, or his capacity to parent effectively. They will comb through social media, interrogate the children after weekend visits, and attempt to build a manufactured narrative of neglect or endangerment. The goal is to reduce the father back to an every other weekend visitor, thereby maximizing their own control and potentially triggering an automatic increase in child support based on the altered custody percentages. The step-by-step details of defending against this specific psychological warfare form the core curriculum of modern male divorce support ecosystems. Men are taught that their most powerful weapon against a custody modification is relentless, unassailable behavioral consistency and extreme documentation. Imagine navigating this threat without a structured strategy. The natural instinct is to fiercely defend your parenting style, to argue with your ex, or to interrogate your children about what their mother is saying. This reactive behavior plays perfectly into the hands of the opposing counsel, generating exactly the type of chaotic conflict they need to justify court intervention. Modern education completely flips this script. Men are trained to treat their custody time as a heavily guarded fortress. They utilize centralized co-parenting applications exclusively, entirely eliminating verbal or text message communication that can be manipulated or taken out of context. They keep meticulous digital journals of their children's activities, medical appointments, school involvement, and emotional well-being during their parenting time. They refuse to take the bait of passive-aggressive emails. Consider the potential outcomes when a judge is presented with a modification petition based on vague allegations of poor parenting. If the father is reactive and defensive, the court may order invasive and expensive custody evaluations. But if the father calmly presents a 2-year, perfectly formatted digital log demonstrating his flawless execution of the existing parenting plan, complete with records of his communication discipline, the judge immediately recognizes the modification for what it is: a frivolous, punitive attack. The modern divorced man is taught to maintain a dedicated legal defense fund, ensuring he always has the capital required to immediately retain elite legal counsel the moment a threat materializes, rather than scrambling for resources under duress. This financial readiness completely strips the former spouse of their primary weapon, which is litigation by financial exhaustion. The cultural shift here is the transformation of the divorced father from a perpetual victim of a biased system into a highly educated, legally insulated, and emotionally regulated architect of his own reality. He understands that the family court system is not a place of justice. It is a marketplace of leverage, and he has mastered the art of maintaining his leverage indefinitely. He has survived the initial trauma, he has rebuilt his identity from zero, he has navigated the treacherous waters of modern socialization, and he has successfully defended his new empire against the inevitable post-decree attacks. He is, for all intents and purposes, a master of his domain. But as the years pass and the dust settles, a new, entirely biological variable begins to alter the landscape of the family dynamic. The children are no longer toddlers or compliant grade schoolers. They are growing older, their cognitive abilities are expanding, and they are developing their own independent voices. What happens to the meticulously crafted stability of the father's empire when the children enter adolescence, and the family court system suddenly grants these highly impressionable teenagers the legal authority to choose which parent they want to live with, opening the door to the most insidious and devastating psychological weapon in the entire divorce landscape. That weapon is coercive psychological control, widely recognized in clinical environments as parental alienation, though the legal system in 2026 still struggles to adequately define, identify, or aggressively prosecute it. The transition from childhood to adolescence represents a massive paradigm shift in the American family court system. During the formative years, a judge evaluates custody based on a highly structured set of best interest factors, heavily relying on the parents to dictate the child's environment. However, as children reach the age of 12 to 14, depending on the specific state jurisdiction, Courts begin to introduce a dangerous new variable into the equation: the preference of the child. Judges will often conduct private, in-chambers interviews with teenagers to determine where they wish to reside. This legal mechanism, originally designed to empower older children, has been widely hijacked by high-conflict individuals to execute the ultimate form of post-decree revenge. By manipulating the impressionable mind of a teenager, a hostile former spouse can effectively launder their own resentment through the voice of the child, completely bypassing the father's carefully constructed legal defenses. Imagine if you have spent the last 5 years executing a flawless shared parenting plan. You have maintained your emotional regulation, provided absolute financial stability, and built a deeply bonded relationship with your son. But as he enters high school, an insidious shift begins to occur. He starts refusing to get out of the car during custody exchanges. He begins parroting complex, adult-level grievances about past financial settlements or litigation history, details he could only possibly know if the other parent had explicitly and maliciously shared court documents with him. He suddenly categorizes your structured, disciplined household as toxic while praising the other parent's household as a sanctuary. The biological instinct of a father facing this sudden, inexplicable rejection from his own child is profound devastation followed immediately by defensive anger. The traditional, outdated cultural advice in this scenario was to simply give the teenager space, hoping they would eventually mature and see the truth. Historical trends prove this passive approach is a catastrophic failure. By stepping back, the father inadvertently validates the false narrative that he is an uncaring or dangerous figure, allowing the psychological programming to calcify into permanent estrangement. Modern divorce help for men tackles the teenager transition with specialized, highly aggressive counter-strategies that completely abandon the passive wait-and-see model. Let us examine the case study of Richard, a commercial aviation pilot living in Atlanta in the current year of 2026. Richard shared equal custody of his 14-year-old daughter. His former spouse, operating out of deep-seated resentment over Richard's new marriage and financial success, began executing a textbook alienation campaign. She transformed her home into a consequence-free zone, eliminating curfews, providing unrestricted access to algorithmic social media, and actively undermining Richard's authority by telling the daughter she did not have to listen to his rules. When the daughter inevitably demanded to live full-time with her mother to avoid Richard's structured environment, the mother immediately filed a modification petition citing the teenager's stated preference. Under the old paradigm, Richard would have likely lost primary custody simply because the judge would have deferred to the 14-year-old's wishes. Instead, Richard deployed a modernized, step-by-step defense engineered specifically for parental alienation scenarios. First, his support network educated him on the absolute necessity of maintaining his impenetrable fortress of calm. He was trained to never argue with his daughter about her mother's behavior, as the alienated child is psychologically primed to report any defensive reaction back to the alienating parent as evidence of abuse. Instead of interrogating his daughter, Richard utilized specialized communication techniques designed to bypass the programmed hostility and connect directly with her core memories of their authentic relationship. He maintained her physical space in his home perfectly, ensuring her room was always ready, quietly signaling unwavering permanence and safety. Simultaneously, Richard's legal team executed a highly specialized procedural defense. They preemptively filed motions requesting the appointment of a highly vetted, specialized guardian ad litem with a documented background in identifying coercive control and enmeshment trauma. They did not simply argue that the mother was alienating the child. They provided forensic evidence. Richard produced years of digital logs demonstrating the sudden, precipitous drop in communication, the correlation between the mother's behavior and the daughter's sudden hostility, and evidence of the mother interfering with his designated parenting time under the guise of the teenager not wanting to go. They successfully petitioned the court for targeted reunification therapy, explicitly requesting a court order that mandated the mother's active cooperation in the therapeutic process, with severe legal and financial penalties attached for non-compliance. By shifting the focus from the teenager's manufactured preference to the mother's documented psychological manipulation, Richard neutralized the weaponized preference and protected his custody rights. The cultural impact of these specialized interventions is monumental. We are moving away from an era where fathers simply resign themselves to losing their teenagers to malicious programming. Men are being educated on the brutal reality that parental alienation is not just bad co-parenting. It is a severe form of psychological child abuse. They are learning to view the hostile teenager not as an adversary, but as a hostage suffering from a form of complex Stockholm syndrome. This paradigm shift requires a man to develop an almost superhuman level of emotional endurance. He must be willing to endure the raw, visceral pain of his child looking him in the eye and reciting a script of hatred written by his former spouse, while simultaneously fighting a relentless, highly strategic legal and therapeutic battle to save that child's mind. It requires a complete mastery of ego suppression, sacrificing the immediate need to be right in favor of the long-term goal of maintaining the parental bond. When a man successfully navigates this harrowing phase, he achieves the ultimate stabilization. He proves that his presence as a father cannot be eradicated by legal maneuvering, financial attrition, or even psychological warfare aimed at his own offspring. He establishes a permanent, unshakable legacy of resilience that his children will eventually recognize when their cognitive development allows them to see the truth of their own history. He has defeated the family court machine, rebuilt his personal empire, and secured the minds of his children against the most insidious manipulation tactics known to modern psychology. He has effectively won the unwinnable war. But the high-conflict personality, entirely depleted of legal avenues and family-based leverage, rarely surrenders peacefully. When they realize the children cannot be used as weapons, and the financial fortress cannot be breached, they look outside the family unit for a final, desperate avenue of destruction. What happens when the battlefield shifts from the private chambers of the family court directly into the public square? And how do modern men survive the devastating, highly coordinated attempts to annihilate their professional livelihood, their corporate reputation, and their standing in the community through the weaponization of human resources and the Digital Whisper campaign? The weaponization of human resources and the Digital Whisper campaign represent the final frontier of post-divorce conflict. When the family court system exhausts its utility for a high-conflict former spouse, the battlefield inevitably shifts to the court of public opinion and the corporate boardroom. In the highly connected, digitally transparent corporate landscape of 2026, a man's professional reputation is his most valuable asset, often tied directly to his ability to generate the income required to sustain his legal defense and child support obligations. Recognizing this vulnerability, hostile actors frequently bypass legal channels entirely, deploying asymmetric warfare designed to trigger immediate corporate termination and social ostracization. Historical trends over the past 5 years show a disturbing spike in ex-spouses leveraging anonymous reporting systems, social media algorithms, and local community networks to execute targeted character assassinations. Imagine if you have spent 2 decades climbing the corporate ladder to become a senior logistics director. You have maintained a flawless personnel record, managed multi-million-dollar budgets, and secured a lucrative compensation package that keeps your children in premium educational environments. Then, without warning, you are called into an emergency meeting with your human resources department. They inform you that an anonymous complaint has been filed via the corporate ethics hotline, alleging that you are engaged in domestic abuse, substance abuse, or that you have been utilizing company assets to facilitate illicit activities during your custody battles. In the modern corporate climate, companies are terrified of liability and public relations disasters. The potential outcome of such an allegation, even entirely fabricated, is immediate suspension pending investigation, loss of security clearances, and potentially the catastrophic termination of your employment. The high-conflict individual knows exactly how to exploit the zero-tolerance policies of modern corporations, using the very mechanisms designed to protect employees as weapons of personal destruction. Let us look at a case study involving a man named Thomas, a vice president of regional sales operating out of Boston. Following a brutal custody victory where Thomas secured primary residence of his children, his former spouse initiated a relentless professional attack. She began sending carefully crafted, ambiguous emails to his executive team, expressing manufactured concern for his mental stability and heavily implying that his home life was bleeding into his professional competence. Under the traditional, outdated model of divorce survival, Thomas would have been blindsided. He might have reacted defensively in the human resources meeting, oversharing details of his divorce in a desperate attempt to clear his name, thereby making the corporate team even more uncomfortable and accelerating his own termination. However, Thomas had engaged with elite professional divorce support networks that anticipate this exact vector of attack. These networks teach men a vital step-by-step protocol known as preemptive corporate inoculation. Months before the custody trial concluded, Thomas sat down with his human resources director and his direct supervisor. Operating entirely from a posture of calm professionalism, He informed them that he was navigating a high-conflict family restructuring. He proactively provided them with official court documentation verifying his legal standing and respectfully warned them that his former spouse had a documented history of erratic behavior and retaliatory communication. He essentially built a firewall around his career. When the malicious emails eventually arrived, the executive team did not panic or initiate an investigation. They immediately recognized the communication as external harassment, exactly as Thomas had predicted, and their corporate legal team issued a swift, severe cease and desist order directly to the former spouse, effectively neutralizing the attack. But the corporate attack is often accompanied by an equally destructive parallel strategy, known as the digital whisper campaign. This involves the systematic destruction of a man's local reputation through community Facebook groups, neighborhood watch applications, and coordinated social media vague posting. The alienating spouse will rarely make direct, actionable allegations that could trigger a defamation lawsuit. Instead, they rely on the power of implication. They post resources for domestic abuse survivors immediately after a court date. They leave subtle comments on mutual friends' posts implying they are finally safe. They utilize the algorithm to slowly paint a picture of a dangerous, unstable man, poisoning the local ecosystem where the man lives and operates. The potential outcomes of this strategy are profound social isolation, where local businesses, school PTA boards, and neighborhood associations quietly exclude the father based entirely on digital rumors. Modern educational support for single fathers addresses this digital assassination with a strategy of absolute information control and aggressive legal boundary setting. Men are trained to never engage in digital combat. Responding to a vague post or attempting to defend oneself in a community comment section is the exact reaction the high-conflict personality desires, as it generates the visible conflict they need to validate their victim narrative. Instead, men are taught the step-by-step process of digital ghosting. This involves locking down all social media architecture, removing all public-facing visibility, and utilizing specialized legal services that monitor the internet for mentions of their name. If the former spouse crosses the line from vague implication into actionable defamation, the modern stabilized man does not send an angry text. He directs his legal counsel to file immediate tort claims for tortious interference with a business contract or straightforward defamation per se, attaching massive financial penalties to the malicious behavior. This level of defense requires a man to view his life as an absolute fortress. He must audit his digital security, change every password, sever joint cellular plans, and ensure that his professional and personal data are locked behind multi-factor authentication. He learns that in 2026, privacy is not a luxury. It is the fundamental armor required to survive the aftermath of a high-conflict family dissolution. By insulating his career and silencing the digital whisper campaign through overwhelming legal and structural discipline, he removes the final external weapons available to the hostile actor. He achieves a state of total environmental control. His children are safe, his finances are growing, his mind is regulated, and his professional legacy is untouchable. He has effectively built an impenetrable wall around his new life, forcing the high-conflict individual to finally retreat into their own chaos. Yet, as the external battles finally cease and the silence of absolute victory settles over his life, a new entirely internal challenge begins to emerge from the depths of his own psychology. The adrenaline that fueled his survival for the past 5 years suddenly dissipates, leaving him face to face with the stark reality of his own mortality and the second half of his life. He has survived the war, but now he must answer a terrifying question that no lawyer or financial planner can solve. How does a man who has spent a decade defined by conflict and survival pivot to a life defined by purpose and meaning? And what happens to the male psyche when the enemy is finally gone, and the only person left to confront in the mirror is the aging, battle-scarred veteran of the American family court system? The transition from active legal combat to profound silence is a psychological shockwave that catches even the most prepared men completely off guard. When the enemy is finally gone, the adrenaline that fueled late-night strategy sessions and relentless documentation suddenly evaporates. Historical trends in male psychology show that this exact moment, the onset of peace, is paradoxically when the highest rates of post-divorce depression occur. Your central nervous system has spent years running highly elevated levels of cortisol, essentially locking your brain into a continuous state of high alert. You have been fighting for your financial survival, your professional reputation, and your fundamental right to be a father. When the gavel strikes for the final time and the dust settles, the immediate biological reaction is a catastrophic crash. The male psyche, stripped of its adversarial focus, stares into an absolute void. In the year 2026, the cultural narrative still largely ignores this existential crisis, expecting men to simply celebrate their freedom and seamlessly integrate back into society. But freedom without purpose is just a different type of prison. Let us examine the case study of a man named Michael, a commercial real estate developer living in Denver, Colorado. Michael executed a flawless legal defense. He protected his generational wealth, secured an impenetrable equal shared parenting schedule, and successfully defended his professional licenses against a barrage of malicious allegations. He won the war. Yet 6 months after the final decree, Michael found himself staring at the ceiling of his luxury apartment at 3 in the morning, experiencing profound apathy and severe burnout. His entire operating system had been calibrated for conflict. Without a motion to file or a false allegation to disprove, he felt entirely obsolete. This is the identity vacuum. Modern divorce support networks recognize this dangerous phase and have developed rigorous, step-by-step protocols to guide men through what clinical professionals term post-traumatic growth. The goal is no longer just survival. It is the deliberate architectural design of a completely new male paradigm. Imagine if your entire adult life was defined by the role of the traditional provider, and then abruptly redefined by the role of the embattled defendant. Now imagine waking up on a crisp Sunday morning with absolutely zero hostile emails in your inbox, zero legal deadlines to meet, and zero domestic fires to extinguish. For a man programmed for battle, that silence is deafening. The immediate, dangerous temptation is to fill that silence with synthetic chaos. Historical trends demonstrate that men in this exact phase often pivot toward high-risk behavior simply to feel the familiar rush of adrenaline. They might engage in reckless financial speculation, extreme physical pursuits without proper training, or immediately plunge into highly volatile romantic relationships. They are subconsciously trying to recreate the high-stakes environment of the family court system, because peace feels completely unnatural to a traumatized nervous system. Modern divorce intercepts this destructive cycle by forcing men to engage in structured recalibration. The step-by-step details of this process involve a radical shift in how a man allocates his most valuable resources, specifically his time, his capital, and his emotional bandwidth. Men are taught to conduct a brutal inventory of their current reality and construct a new, purpose-driven framework that has absolutely nothing to do with their former spouse or their past trauma. For Michael in Denver, this meant systematically disengaging from the divorce community itself. Once you are stabilized, dwelling continuously on the injustice of the family court system becomes a severe liability. He was guided to channel his immense strategic capacity into philanthropic development, utilizing his real estate expertise to build affordable housing infrastructure for veterans. He replaced the destructive adrenaline of legal warfare with the constructive dopamine of building a tangible, positive legacy. This is the exact pivot point where a man transitions from a victim of circumstance to an active, sovereign architect of his future. The cultural impact of this individual stabilization ripples outward, fundamentally altering the generational legacy of the American family. We must look deeply at the potential outcomes for the children who witness this profound transformation. Children are hyper-observant, and they internalize the coping mechanisms of their parents. When a father successfully navigates the post-war void and models absolute emotional regulation, physical vitality, and authentic purpose, he provides a living blueprint of resilience. For his sons, he breaks the generational curse of the emotionally suppressed, broken divorced man. He shows them that masculinity is not defined by stoic suffering, but by the capacity to rebuild a magnificent life from absolute rubble. For his daughters, he sets an uncompromising standard of how a healthy, autonomous man operates in the world, directly influencing the boundaries they will set in their own future relationships. The father becomes a pillar of unshakable strength, entirely independent of the chaotic dynamics of the past. To achieve this level of mastery, a man must also confront the brutal physical toll of his past battles. The stress of family court accelerates cellular aging and depletes critical hormone levels. The modern approach to male divorce recovery integrates advanced health protocols, emphasizing step-by-step endocrine optimization, rigorous cardiovascular conditioning, and strict nutritional discipline. You cannot build a generational legacy on a crumbling physical foundation. Men are engaging in targeted physical transformations, not for vanity, but to build the physical endurance required to maximize the second half of their lives. They are optimizing their sleep architecture, completely eliminating toxic coping mechanisms like alcohol, and treating their bodies with the exact same strategic reverence they applied to their legal defense. This holistic approach ensures that the veteran of the family court system does not just survive his past, but actively dominates his future. Furthermore, this biological and psychological reset completely changes how men interact with their local communities. Instead of hiding in shame or isolating themselves, stabilized men are emerging as leaders. They are coaching youth sports teams with a renewed sense of patience, mentoring younger men who are just entering the terrifying initial phases of family separation, and establishing powerful new business networks built on shared resilience rather than superficial social climbing. They are proving that the destruction of a nuclear family does not mandate the destruction of the individual. By focusing intensely on their own continuous improvement, they naturally attract high-quality friendships and professional opportunities, further accelerating their upward trajectory and leaving the toxicity of their past entirely in the rearview mirror. The culmination of this physical, mental, and spiritual rebuild creates an entirely new demographic in the United States. We are witnessing the emergence of a highly educated, legally savvy, financially insulated, and emotionally impenetrable class of men. They have walked through the absolute fires of a biased system and emerged stronger than anyone could have ever anticipated. They have stabilized their homes and secured the psychological well-being of their children. But when a massive demographic of highly capable men realizes the profound structural flaws of the machine that attempted to destroy them, they rarely stay quiet forever. What happens when these fully optimized men begin to organize, shifting their focus from personal survival to systemic revolution? And how is this newly formed brotherhood preparing to dismantle the very foundations of the American family court system from the inside out? The transformation from isolated survival to collective, systemic revolution is the most significant cultural shift in modern American family law. In 2026, the brotherhood of stabilized, post-divorce men is no longer a loose affiliation of support groups meeting in church basements. It has evolved into a highly capitalized, fiercely organized political and legal machine. These men have realized that surviving a burning building is not enough. You must dismantle the architecture that allowed the fire to start. The American family court system, historically a multi-billion-dollar industry reliant on prolonged conflict and asset depletion, is suddenly facing an adversary it never anticipated. It is facing its own fully funded, legally educated, and emotionally impenetrable alumni. Historical trends indicate that when a specific demographic is systematically disenfranchised, but retains its earning power and cognitive discipline, the inevitable result is the formation of strategic political action. We are witnessing the rapid rise of dedicated legal defense funds financed entirely by men who have rebuilt their empires, and are now dedicating a substantial percentage of their corporate revenue to ensure no other father endures the same crucible. Consider the case study of Jonathan, a specialized technology entrepreneur operating out of Texas. After surviving a devastating custody battle that nearly bankrupted his initial startup, Jonathan did not just rebuild his software company. He utilized his network of high-net-worth post-divorce men to form a strategic legislative lobbying coalition. Their objective was not to complain about the system, but to ruthlessly rewrite the statutory baseline. They targeted the highly subjective best interest of the child standard, which historically granted judges absolute, unchecked discretion, often resulting in culturally biased outcomes against fathers. Jonathan's coalition drafted, funded, and aggressively pushed legislation mandating a rebuttable presumption of equal shared parenting. They utilized step-by-step data analytics to prove that children with equal, unfettered access to both capable parents demonstrate significantly lower rates of anxiety, substance abuse, and academic failure. They presented this undeniable empirical data directly to state legislators, effectively forcing lawmakers to choose publicly between protecting a lucrative legal industry or protecting the psychological development of their state's children. The systemic dismantling goes far beyond the halls of state capitals. These men are executing a highly coordinated attack on the financial lifeblood of the high-conflict divorce machine. Imagine if you could completely bypass the courtroom and entirely neutralize the leverage of opposing counsel. The modern brotherhood is actively building and funding private, binding arbitration networks specifically designed for family restructuring. These alternative dispute resolution models are staffed by neutral forensic accountants and specialized child psychology experts, completely removing the adversarial litigation attorneys from the equation. Men entering new marriages are now drafting prenuptial agreements that explicitly mandate this specific private arbitration in the event of a dissolution, effectively starving the traditional family court system of its future revenue pipeline. The potential outcome of this mass exodus from public courtrooms is the financial collapse of the cottage industry of litigation lawyers, who historically thrived on manufacturing chaos and dragging out the discovery process. Furthermore, the revolution has squarely targeted judicial accountability. Historically, family court judges operated in relative obscurity, with their rulings shielded behind closed doors, sealed records, and a cultural hesitance to challenge the bench. The optimized brotherhood of 2026 is utilizing open-source intelligence and advanced legal data scraping to track, analyze, and publish the specific ruling patterns of every family court judge in the United States. They are systematically identifying judges who consistently ignore empirical evidence of parental alienation, who weaponize financial discovery, or who default to outdated gender paradigms. But they are not just publishing this data on obscure forums. They are funding targeted, highly visible political campaigns to unseat these judges during local elections. They are transforming the pain of their past into highly mobilized voter turnout, proving that the divorced father demographic is now a unified, single-issue voting bloc fully capable of ending political careers overnight. The ultimate cultural impact of this massive mobilization is the complete, permanent eradication of the disposable father myth. For generations, society passively absorbed the narrative that men were secondary parents, easily replaced by monthly child support transfers and alternate weekend visits. The stabilized men of 2026 have violently rejected this premise, not with unguided anger, but with overwhelming competence, strategic discipline, and organized capital. They have proven that a father's active daily presence is an irreplaceable biological and psychological necessity. Step by step, they have reclaimed their narrative in the public square, demonstrating that the most dangerous entity to a corrupt, deeply entrenched system is a man who has lost everything, rebuilt it from absolute zero, and returned to the battlefield with the exact resources required to permanently change the rules of the game. They have transformed the deepest trauma of their lives into a legacy of systemic protection for the next generation of American families, ensuring their sons will never face the same biased machinery. They have won the personal wars of emotional regulation, and they are currently winning the systemic battles of legislative reform. The default parenting laws are changing state by state. The demonstrably biased judges are being systematically replaced at the ballot box, and the private arbitration networks are expanding globally. But an institutional industry that generates tens of billions of dollars annually does not simply surrender its power, its leverage, and its massive revenue without orchestrating a massive, unprecedented counterattack. The legal establishment is currently analyzing this brotherhood, mapping its corporate funding sources, identifying its leadership nodes, and preparing a legislative and media response designed specifically to crush this rebellion before it can codify its victories into federal law. As we look ahead at this rapidly shifting landscape, we are forced to ask a terrifying question about the future of the American family. What happens when the traditional legal establishment forms a quiet alliance with the algorithmic media giants to launch a coordinated nationwide smear campaign against the shared parenting movement? And exactly how will these highly optimized men defend their newly constructed reality against an enemy that controls the very flow of digital information and cultural perception in America?